this event this morning, I'd like you to come forward and say a few words to the audience. Thank you, team.
Thank you, Viv. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd like to welcome and acknowledge the representatives and guests of the Australian Vietnamese community, religious delegations and community groups who have travelled from around Australia to be here today. We're here today because Viv has contacted me, the VCA has contacted me to bring our attention to concerning reports of religious oppression and ongoing human rights issues in Vietnam. It's appropriate that we are able to gather here in the Australian Parliament to exercise our democratic rights to talk about these issues here today. I was very pleased to be able to speak at a protest rally calling for attention to the Formosa steel catastrophe and the ongoing environmental impacts of it in the region on the steps of the Victorian Parliament earlier last year. It was an easy thing for me to do because I did not have to risk of repression or the violation of my rights as a consequence of exercising those democratic rights in Australia. The Catholic Church and community activists have continued this fight for attention on this issue in the face of significant resistance. The freedom to practice religion without persecution is a fundamental human right, and any reports of religious oppression and targeting needs to be taken seriously, whether it is here in Australia or overseas. So today, the purpose of this meeting, the purpose of this gathering, is about listening, engaging and dialogue with people that accounts of the current human rights situation in Vietnam. So I'd like to thank the VCA for organising this morning's briefing, for bringing these first-hand voices, these expert voices here today with us in the Australian Parliament. Eager to hear from the speakers. So I will concede the floor to them so that I can start to listen. Thank you.
Who is the federal member for Goldstein and who is, as we know, a former human rights commissioner. If I may just show you this 5 minutes film clip of the situation in Vietnam. And I do acknowledge the presence of Claire O'Neill and Jason Clare, and also other staffers from other members of Parliament and representatives from Amnesty International, along with representatives from the Catholics community, the Ma Hao congregation, and all of our representatives from the VCA. Thank you. So you might remember back in April last year, Formosa dumped a whole heap of toxic waste into the ocean, affecting about 220 kilometres of coastline and killing hundreds and hundreds of tons of dead fish, and effectively destroying the tourism industry, the fishery industry in that entire middle part of Vietnam, all the way from Vung An right through to Nghệ An, Hà Tĩnh, and pretty close to Da Nang, and the waste is around. So this is a rally from the Catholic priests in the middle part of Vietnam. They are supporting the victims to seek compensation by helping them fill out the forms and taking them to the local authorities. This is Father Vung Nam, who is one of the priests who has been on the list to be potentially arrested for a 20-year sentence or potentially a death sentence. Mr. Thảm, who has also been arrested in recent days. And that's Mr. Nguyễn on the side, who was caught by the police overnight and was released dead and with his neck stitched up. And Mr. Nguyễn and Mr. Thảm are both followers of Hoàng Buddhism. His sister, who is currently residing in the United States and is a resident of the United States, is taking the issue to the US government to seek an understanding and clarification. This is his wife and his son. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like now to invite Tim Wilson to the stage to share a few words with us.
Well, thank you, Viv, very much for that kind introduction, and I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet and pay respect to the elders past and present, but also to thank you very much for that video that we have just seen, although I've got to say it's immensely disturbing, and so it's one of the videos such as this that brings home, I think for a lot of us, particularly in Australia, like Tim said before, where we thankfully are able to live free of this persecution, particularly on the basis of faith, or the freedom to be able to do basic things like freedom of assembly and petition, that brings us home to us the struggles of so many people around the world. And in the end, behind every human rights story is human rights issue is a human story, a story of people struggling for a sense of justice and freedom in society and in the world, and often against oppression and tyranny, or often not directed to them by the government and its agents. And so that's why I wanted to congratulate all of you for coming and assembling here today, and like to acknowledge Milton, who's just arrived, the member for Oxley, as well as David Coleman, who's arrived, the member for Banks, who has also joined us from the coalition side of politics. And particularly because religious freedom is so central to our way of life across the world. It's central to Australian way of life because it's actually the only right that's protected in our constitution. But it's essential across the world because it's intertwined with so many other basic freedoms which we enjoy and play such an important part in our way of life. As you've just seen, videos demonstrating that religious liberty include people's freedom to manifest themselves, to express their conscience, both of freedom of conscience and freedom of speech, but also of freedom of assembly and the right to petition their government and stand up for principles that they hold dear. And the human cost of when those are not respected, particularly in the most horrific case you showed before, Craig Kelly, who's just walked in the room as well, is ultimately often of extreme sacrifice. And we can't ever sit blindly or idly and allow these things to go on across the world. Tim Watt said in his remarks, and I welcome his comments very strongly earlier, that one of the privileges of being a member of Parliament is the freedom to stand up and express your opinion or will on matters. But we also have, shall we say, the privilege, but sometimes the absent sense of justice for ourselves, that we can make these remarks but not go home and face the consequences. And that's what everybody in this room in their own way does, by standing up and expressing themselves and living their liberty, living their values, is putting their own position and their own security on the line. A few years ago, I went and spoke at the Australian Embassy in Vietnam at the guest of our ambassador on the importance of freedom of speech, including the freedom for a lot of religious communities within Vietnam to assemble online, to have discussions as well as to meet in person and to manifest their faith-based background. And while the Vietnamese government did their best, frankly, to deny me a visa as Australia's Human Rights Commissioner to enter the country, the intimidation that was directed towards those people who came to here was, I have to say, deeply disturbing and brought home to me very much that story of the intimidation that people can experience at the hand of government when they want to silence and censor people's liberties. And that's why I want to express, I'm sure on behalf of all of the members of Parliament here and on both sides of politics, how much we admire your strength and your resilience and your courage. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. If I now may like to invite Duan Nguyen, who is representing the Vietnamese community in Australia now. Duan will give us a bit of an overview on what's happening today. Thank you very much, Duan.
Thank you, Vi. Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owner of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to the elders past and present. Mr. Tim Watts, member for Children, thank you for hosting today's event. Good morning, MPs, members of the media, religious leaders, community leaders, ladies and gentlemen. As Vi said, my name is Duan Nguyen. I'm one of the Vice President of the Vietnamese community in Australia. I also acknowledge Mr. Bon Nguyen. He's also here today. He's our President. Due to short notice, he couldn't plan ahead because he just came back from a trip from the US, attending a similar conference like this. And he wasn't sure that he could attend it until late last night that he could make it today. So I am actually speaking on his behalf. On behalf of the VCA Federal, I thank Vi Nguyen and her team for organising this event. And I congratulate the work that you have done so far for the community here in Australia, as well as raising our voice for the people of Vietnam. Ladies and gentlemen, before I give you a bit of information about the current situation in Vietnam, I would like to give you a bit of information about the Vietnamese community in Australia. Most of you know, since the war, about 2 million Vietnamese left Vietnam due to the communists. That's broke all the international protocols, treaties, agreements, took over the south of Vietnam. And today, or up until today, we have about 200,000 Vietnamese of Australian who live in Australia. Now, from my reading, about 100,000 Vietnamese resettled in Australia by way of coming through the refugee channel, the others through the family reunion, and in the last decade or so, coming through the skilled migrants visa stream. Now, the majority of us are successful migrants, so we are proud to be called Australian of Vietnamese heritage. I just want to paint a picture for you about the Vietnamese community. We contribute into this community through different ways. Besides doctors, lawyers, engineers, accountants that you may have worked with or used their services throughout the country, the sandwich that you eat today could be baked by a Vietnamese Australian. Your local fruit shop or the butchery is likely to be ran by a local Vietnamese Australian. The thousands of lunch bars across the country are likely to be ran by a Vietnamese Australian. And the chances are that if you get your nail done this weekend, it will be done by a Vietnamese Australian. In saying that, we just want to say the Vietnamese Australian community has contributed well into this community. We work hard to build our family and the country. And we've learned a lot about human rights here in Australia and the international way of understanding human rights. So as Vietnamese Australians, we of course still have a strong link with our country or our relatives and friends back in Vietnam. And in my opinion, and I'm sure most of other Vietnamese leaders here would agree, only Vietnamese outside of Vietnam would have a strong voice against the Vietnamese Communist government. Therefore, we are here asking for the support of the Australian government into examining the current situation in Vietnam. No doubt you have heard, we've seen pictures of the toxic waste that has been discharged by the Formosa steel plants into the Ha Tinh Sea in central Vietnam around April last year. Now, this environmental disaster has caused tremendous effect to the environment, to the thousands and millions of people who live in the center of Vietnam. Over 40,000 fishermen and their families who live on the fishing industry. Now, because of this, they can't really fish anymore. Within the coastlines are all polluted, and the fish stocks are no longer there. Even if the fish stocks are there, it's not safe to eat. Now, if they go any further than that, they have been controlled and bullied by other Chinese guides or fishermen, etc. So you can see the situation for the people of central Vietnam are very in a situation where they need help, they need to raise a voice. Now, the Vietnamese Communist government has, I guess we can use the word kindly, accepted $500 million compensations from the Formosa steel plants for the damage they have caused. Now, $500 million for the support is nothing in our opinion. For similar scales of oil spills around the world, you're looking at around $1.5 to $2 billion for restoring the environment and to support the people in that community. Now, in saying that, up until today, we have not heard or see any real impact on supporting the victims of the people of Central Vietnam from this $500 million. The only thing we can say is these money have lined the pockets of the government officials. And why we are saying that? Because up until today, Formosa plant is still operating, and the chemicals, toxic chemicals, are still discharging into the ocean. So that's to say, anything that we do, anything that the people say, they will be controlled and arrested by special police in Vietnam. Now, in recent days, these are events that happens in recent days. There are many other events that's happening as well. The authorities have entered the death anniversaries ceremonies of the Hoa Hao Buddhist followers. I just want to say a bit on this point. For Westerners, birthday is a very important day for a lot of us. But for Vietnamese, the death anniversary is an event, is a lot more important as well. And normally we celebrate the death anniversary of a person who passed away more than we celebrate one's birthday. So it's a very significant event, but the authority forced enter. They crack down on the Buddhist, Hoa Hao Buddhist followers. Mr. Bui Van Chung's mother, they attacked him and injured many others, Hoa Hao followers, that were in attendance to that event. They have seized a number of Hoa Hao Buddhist followers, such as Mr. Vương Văn Tha and his extended family, including his elderly mother and 4-year-old baby, for a day, and ends with terrorist acts that continues to his family. They have bribed people to eliminate the Catholic priest, Father Nguyễn Văn Thục and Father Đặng Hữu Nam, who have led the protest in February in central Vietnam, in raising their voice about the Formosa issue. But they have used tactics similar to that of the land reform or the cultural revolution that's occurred in the 50s by the communists in northern Vietnam, who have killed close to 1.5 million Vietnamese back then. So they have used different tactics to terrorize, to denounce the priests and other followers. They claim that they are traitors and they are wanting to overturn the government, etc. Now, these sort of tactics is not accepted, ladies and gentlemen, and it's only, again, people like us who live overseas, who are strong enough, who have the facilities to be able to raise our voice. And we are here to ask for your support to continue on to raise our voice throughout the Parliament and, of course, internationally as well. Now, you have seen the image of Mr. Nguyen Hu Tan, who was arrested. He was a Hoa Hao, a member of the Hoa House. He was arrested overnight and he will return the next day with his throat cut. Now, the story that we have heard is unbelievable, and I'm saying if you have any intentions to get to know more about this, please go on YouTube and some of the videos that you have seen, and it has been reported by some of the mainstream medias as well. They allege that he was arrested, taken into custody. He was put into an empty cell for an interview. The officers left the room. They came back later. He killed himself with a paper cutting implement. And they claim that he went through the bag of one of the officials to get out this paper knife, or the knife to cut the paper, and cut his throat 3 times to kill himself. Who on earth would believe such an act? Seriously, if you have come across and you look at the images, how would someone cut themselves? And again, why would a police officer carry a cutting implement in their bag? Okay. Now they have released a CCTV footage showing a very blurry or dotty image of this incident that was captured. But it's something that we do not believe on. Now, other incident that we would like you to take note of, also, for example, the human rights abuse against campaigner human rights Trần Huỳnh Duy Thức. They have been sentenced to 16 years in prison. Lê Công Định and Madam Mushroom Nam, which is her nickname, her real name is Nguyễn Ngọc Như Quỳnh, are to name a few. Now, the patriot of the Vietnamese Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam, the Most Honorable Thích Quyền Quang, and his supporters have also been house arrest. Mr. Lê Công Cầu from Huế is a follower. He wanted to come into Saigon to support the most vulnerable and to take him to the hospital. He was prevented from visiting him. So those are the actions that you can see. It's ongoing, and it's affecting the human rights issue within Vietnam. The Vietnamese community here in Australia, we condemn the terrorist behaviours and request that the Australian government and the international human rights body and other organisations to take note and take actions into these issues. We condemn such tactics by the Vietnamese Communist government against the victims of major environmental disaster and their actions on religious people and leaders. We demand that the Vietnamese Communist government immediately release the campaigners such as Trần Huỳnh Duy Thức, Lê Công Định, and Vương Văn Thảm. And this is very important, and I hope that the parliamentary here, or members of parliament here today, can take note of this and take more serious approach into the reviewing of international aid into Vietnam. Our information, we understand that Australia support approximately $170 million of aid into Vietnam a year for over 15 years now. And the situation in terms of human rights in Vietnam hasn't been better. So we ask that you review this and have a more result-driven approach because clearly the situation is getting worse each day. I just would like to pause here. You see earlier on the screen some of the images where local authorities, police officers are taking charge or advance into villages who are protecting their lands and etc. Now there are strategies in Vietnam where the authority would sell the land in bulk, so it could be a few thousands of hectares into foreign ownership companies, etc. And what they do is rather they give the authority to individual local landowners to sell separate contracts to business owners or corporations, but they don't. What they do is they just go down as an authority, they go down and say, look, you've got to sell this land on this price, etc., etc. So many who owns a lot of land, they would sell it because they get a lot of money in terms of the land. But people who have small piece of land, they don't get much, and they can't have other way of living if they sell the land, because most Vietnamese who own lands are farmers or orchard growers. If they sell that, what are they going to live on? So the authority would push them through and push them over anyway. So therefore, that is why these sort of land reforms, you see many of them around in Vietnam as well these days. Now we hope, moving forward, arising from events like this, that the Vietnamese community in Australia will continue to work with the Australian government, in particular the Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull, and the Foreign Minister, the Honourable Julia Bishop, and of course the opposition side of politics as well, pressuring the Prime Minister, if he visits Vietnam for the APEC summit towards the end of this year, to directly raise this issue with the Vietnamese government. Now, as well as that, we asked the Australian government to review the Australia-Vietnam Human Rights Dialogue. Now, we have dialogues every year, and we just don't know why, or what have been agreed, or what have been reported, but these issues happening in and out almost daily in Vietnam. One campaigner would be arrested, they would be released after some pressure from the international community. Another campaigner will be arrested on different side of the country or for different reasons, etc. So it's an ongoing thing. It's a structured and planned by the Vietnamese Communist government to rule the country using force and trying to intimidate the citizens in speaking out. It is with honour that we, as Australians, will be able to be coming into a parliament like this to raise our voice, but in Vietnam you can't even say it on the street. That's how sad it is. I can tell you right now, all that we are talking here today is monitored and being watched by the Vietnamese authorities. And why are we saying that? Because the majority of the people who are here could not leave Vietnam, or so could not enter Vietnam. That is a fact. Okay? And up until today, we still have asylum seekers from Vietnam. There are hundreds and thousands of Vietnamese who are waiting in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and in Malaysia, etc., seeking for help because of the crackdown that they have enforced in the last few years. And right here in this room, we have a few people who are in need of support of a protection visa as well. So ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you for your time and thank you for listening. And we hope that you could continue to support. This is not about us here in Australia, it's about the people of Vietnam. And it's about the Vietnamese, so it's about the Australian people use our international aid effectively and return with a positive result for humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. And the last word I would like to leave with you is, don't believe in what the Communist report will say, but look at their actions. Thank you very much.
It is true that it is only in this country, right in this very institution, this building, that it represents the highest level of representation that the Vietnamese Australians always want to have. That is democracy, and this is something that we would love to see happen in Vietnam. On that, we'd like to introduce Chris Hayes. You know that Chris Hayes has been a long-standing campaigner of this issue with the Vietnamese community, and we thank you, Chris, very much for coming here this morning. Please put our hands together for Chris Hayes.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome to the People's House. I know many of you have been here before, and this is one of the things you can do as Australian citizens. as I've often referred to when we're talking to our Vietnamese community, before 1975, before the fall of Saigon, we had very few Vietnamese people here. We had a number of people studying under the Colombo name, but it wasn't until those boats started arriving after the fall of Saigon that people started thinking about what was occurring in Vietnam. And I've got to say, in that little over 40 years, just look what the Vietnamese have been able to achieve. And Duan's explained a bit about it. If you look at our professions, they're heavily represented by people of Vietnamese heritage, like Dinh Tran, or Duan himself being a lawyer, the doctors in our communities, the architects, the builders, the engineers. We have a very high representation of Vietnamese people. The thing that also impressed the people that came from Vietnam, they have a very passionate view about looking after their adopted community. Now, whether it was the Victorian bushfires or the floods in Queensland or alternatively the Blue Mountains bushfires, as Jason Clare well knows, in our neck of woods, it's been the Vietnamese who were the very first to convene fundraising events, and just not fundraising events, but on a particular event I attended that pulled in over about $165,000 for the Queensland Premier's flood appeal in one event alone. I sort of got I inquired, why did the Vietnamese do it? I thought it was a very good thing to do. And a good friend of Jason and mine, Dr. Bin Lu, told me of this old Vietnamese saying that loosely translated, if you eat the fruit of the tree, you have regard to those who planted the seed. So in coming to this country, they adopted responsibility, regardless of where they lived. They considered themselves Australian as anybody else, and they adopted that responsibility. So I thought that was my way of thinking, what a marvellous ethos for all Australians to adopt. And the other aspect about the people who came here from Vietnam is that they never forgot where they come from. They never forgot the circumstances, how they got here, or why they came here. Bear in mind, people came here because they were fleeing tyranny. They were fleeing an oppressive regime. They came here for freedom. They came here for a hope of a better life for themselves and their families. And of all the migrants that we have, and probably starting with the very first boat people that came in a little bit over 200 and something years ago, although wearing chains in those days, of all the migrants that have come here, if you look at the contributions that people have made to this society in a short, compressed period of 40 years, I don't think anyone compares to the contribution the Vietnamese made. The other aspect, I think, for the Vietnamese, they are very much focused on issues of human rights. And this again makes them model Australian citizens. They believe passionately in freedom, democracy, and respect for human rights. And when they see what is occurring in Vietnam today, and particularly the issue about the Formosa steel toxic discharge, it sort of brings this to a head. And Duan's right, the Formosa company, by the way, is a Taiwanese-owned company, not a company owned by the Vietnamese Communist Party or anything, a Taiwanese-owned company. I'll come back to the significance of that in a minute. But they have made a compensation payment to the government of $500 million. But that hasn't flowed through to more than 100,000 people who are directly affected by this toxic discharge. People who rely on the fishing industry, the fishermen, those who work in the processing factories and all those. We see reports now of people having to move. Kids can't go to school because parents can't afford the education tuition. Families having to move from one location because there is no work, because they've been traditionally relying on the fishing industry. And in terms of Father Nam and Father Took, their great crime is leading, not so much a protest, but leading people to exercise their legal rights. What occurred in April this year is they were going to take people, 200 people, down to the Ha Tin court. And they were going to take a sue the Formosa Steel Company for preparation for compensation. So a just cause. They were prevented from doing that. They were prevented from going. They were prevented from exercising, what I would have thought was their legal rights. Now, that compensation hasn't got through to the people on the ground who have been relying on this industry. Now, can I just say a little bit about the Formosa Steel Company, which I think is actually called Formosa Plastics Company, that operates Formosa Steel, Taiwanese-owned company. I don't think all our criticism should just be vented at the Vietnamese government for the way they loosely conducted their initial investigation, very, very tardy over a long period of time, and compensation has been paid to them, but hasn't followed through to those relying on this industry. Where we have companies that come either from the West or from other democracies such as Taiwan that choose to set up factories and enterprises in a country such as Vietnam, we cannot allow people, I don't think, that respect environmental laws, respect labour laws, have a good regard for regulation in their own countries, but for commercial reasons want to invest in Vietnam where they think they can exploit loose laws, can bribe their way through to getting their way in a country such as Vietnam. And it wasn't just the Formosa Steel Company. Many other companies in the past have done very similar things, foreign-owned companies. Nike being one of them, the Mai Phong shoe factory being another. They exploited labour rights. They relied on the Vietnamese authorities to suppress strikes, to suppress workers exercising collective bargaining rights to get their way. Now, when we criticise the government, and as you know, I've done plenty of criticism of the Vietnamese government here in this place, in the People's House, Parliament of Australia, but we'll also reserve the right to criticise those Western countries and countries that seek to exploit the people and the environment of Vietnam for commercial reasons. And we will continue to do that. But only 2 weeks ago, I had the pleasure of talking to Father Nam through Vietnamese Sydney Radio. But it was quite clear that those 2 Catholic priests are being persecuted now because they did lead people trying to exercise their legal rights. There is an enormous campaign now taking place in the Vung diocese to get people, including the Vietnamese Country Women's Union, to act hostilely to these 2 priests. And to the point that there's people running around trying to petition the government, local authorities, to arrest the priests and exercise the maximum punishment of 20 years in prison. Now, this is all occurring as we speak. And now, and Duan just mentioned the issue about in terms of the Buddhist monks. We are now seeing what's emerging is a suppression of religious liberty. And as Father would appreciate, it's not just getting up and taking care of the spiritual needs of the community. The religious leaders, particularly in a community like Vietnam, look after communities, they look after various aspects and help people. And in this case, those two priests were helping people exercise their legal rights, as I understand it, in the Vietnamese constitution. So we need to be aware of the people who we trade with, and we do have a good and healthy trading relationship with Vietnam. I think that should continue. I think Duan also makes a good point that we contribute significantly into aid into Vietnam. But our aid should be tied. We just don't want to hand over a bunch of cash. We want to say that we'll make a contribution to various things. It might be an improvement, the demonstrated improvement in human rights. It might be that we invest into their judicial system if we see the emergence of the observance of the rule of law. And these have got to be quantitative things. We need to be able to measure it. Simply throwing money after money in respect of poor and obscene, in many respects, behaviour doesn't make much sense. I know the Americans have walked away from the TPP and for various reasons, and I think there might have been certainly under truth in the fact that the Vietnamese had shown some greater, or appear to have a greater respect for human rights as they were entering those TPP negotiations with the Americans. However, since the Americans pulled away from that, you can see there's been a re-emergence of some very harsh treatment against those who stand up for labour rights, against those who stand up for environmental rights, and those who stand up for the rights of people to be able to exercise their legal rights in Vietnam. So I think as a trading partner, and I've often said, and I know a number of people in this room haven't been happy that I've said that, if we really consider ourselves to be a friend of Vietnam, and that's not a friend of the Communist Party, but a friend of Vietnam, we should be showing some leadership, some encouragement as to where we think they can make changes, and those things have got to be a respect for the freedom of association, the freedom of speech, religious liberty. These are all things that will help Vietnam in the future to be able to actually play a larger part with the West, not only just in trading, but to bear in mind that we did support their involvement to the United Nations Human Rights Council. We expected when we did that Vietnam would have to have a view about themselves, introspective, that they would show a greater respect internally in Vietnam about human rights. And yet we failed to see that. So once again, thank you for inviting me to participate today. I'm going to have to leave shortly because we're in the midst of another debate in the House at the moment on education, which I'll be speaking on. I have nothing but admiration for the Vietnamese people. You are model Australian citizens. Your views for democracy, freedom and respect for human rights qualifies you for that, and the way that you adopt everything else that impacts on your fellow Australians really sets you apart. Thank you.
Okay, with Craig Kenny and Jason Clare, I'd like to invite Father Gilby, who is representing the Catholic Church today, to speak on the human rights issues, immigration issue in Vietnam. Thank you, Father Gilby, and he is supported by the Buddhist congregation and also the Baha'u congregation here as well. Thank you, Father.
First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land upon which we stand, and also we hold all sorts of democratic meetings. Also pay respect to their elder past and present. I also couldn't help saying that I also acknowledge standing in this house, the House of People, a great symbol of democracy that we all enjoy, and millions of other people wish to live in this sort of society, and they can't have it. I also acknowledge the presence of various members of the Parliament on both sides of politics, also commissioners of human rights and from other governing parties of the Australian government. Father Peter Tuan said before that Vietnamese have contributed so much in this society. Mentioned various professions. In fact, a very qualified school teacher. I taught in our school. I belong to a religious order called Salesians of Don Bosco. We specialize in education, and I taught in school for 14 years in 2 schools in Victoria and 1 in Hobart. And I'd like to use that as my little contribution to this society. And actually, as a religious priest, I do not have a personal wage from that profession. The the salary that I have is a very humble stipend that sent to my congregation, and then I will ask simply for enough to live. So I'd like to be grateful to the Australian people and government for allowing the Vietnamese to have a great future here, and that's my little contribution as return to this beautiful society and country. Because the oppression in Vietnam at the moment is so strongly focused on the very religious liberty of human beings. So I would like to take this opportunity to speak a few words. I know that in my studies of theology and other subjects, communism is originally a philosophy, but I believe it became deviously twisted into a political system that fundamentally deprives people of all their liberties: freedom of speech, of religion, of press, civil liberties of any kind. Does not exist at all. I grew up in this regime for the first 5 years of my teenage years, and I've been living here for 35 years, so I can see the difference between here and there. In terms of religious liberty, there is no such a thing under the communist regime. And if there's any at all, any religious activities, such as pastoral, ministerial, or liturgical, or administration, if they are allowed to take place, they are strictly controlled and closely monitored. Religious oppression in Vietnam has always been there, and in subtle ways, they exercise that, they use that to control the people. Over the last 10 years, the Communist Vietnamese government began a more open oppression and persecution of the Catholic Church and other religions over there by forcefully taking over or confiscating churches' properties, such as physical churches and buildings, including cemeteries. They take over cemeteries. They couldn't leave the dead alone. Cemeteries and religious congregation properties. I'd like to share my personal experience. I returned in 1997 after I was ordained a priest here with great difficulties to be at home. All sorts of permission had to be applied for, and eventually I was allowed to celebrate the Eucharist in the parish church, but there were police sitting in the church watching me, and during the celebration, my parish priest was called out of the church and reprimanded for allowing me to stand in the middle. And then after the celebration, I was asked by the parish priest that make sure your families have money ready to give it to them so that they can allow you to have a party afterwards. That was in 1997. In 2008, I returned on the occasion of the parish priest's death, and I applied for celebrating an open outdoor Eucharist. 3 days before that, they allowed me to do it, and then 3 hours before we got everything ready, 3 hours before we started, I was given a ban from it. I was banned from celebrating that Eucharist, and I asked why, and they wouldn't give me a reason. And then I asked through their men, say that what can I do to have the permission? And they said, well, give them money, then you have permission, which I refused to do. And so so many incidents, so many accidents, so many things that happened there that they deliberately oppress religious liberties over there. And so in recent times, as we have heard, Father Nam and Father Tok have been severely punished for their simply speaking on behalf of their people and parishioners. The Catholic Diocese of Vinh, which is situated in that affected area by the Formosa's steel company, and we have heard so much of that already. And so these two very courageous priests spoke up on behalf of people and taking their people to the government, the local authorities, to demand more justice for these suffering people. And Tuan mentioned before $500 million for compensation, but I believe that the Communist government probably withheld half of that, if not more. And even full compensation of $500 million, what is that for hundreds of thousands of people affected by it? And so the Vietnamese Communist authorities have falsely accused the two Catholic priests for being opportunistic, using the people to conduct propaganda against the state. And these two priests have always been spoken for the rights of the people, for freedom of expression, religious liberty, and fairness and justice. They have been actively pursuing for a clear and adequate compensation for the affected fishing families. By again, as I said before, taking the people to the court, taking people to the street, marching peacefully, but they were physically and violently attacked by the uniform and undercover police by stoning them. And the two priests have been strictly monitored and closely followed by the local police in their movements. And last week we saw the video before Father Nam was in the minibus, and the driver was taken away after the bus was stopped by the police. And so we are here to definitely demonstrate our solidarity with Fathers Nam and Tuk and with the Vietnamese Catholics there, and all believers and indeed all people of Vietnam there who are being oppressed, both subtly and also in open violence, and subsequently they suffered terribly at the hands of the local police and by the communist regime in general. We are here definitely to make an appeal to the Australian government, the opposition and other governing parties in our parliament to attentively listen to our pain and concern. And I am sure that being Australians, we love our freedom, justice and peace. And so I'm sure you can feel the same pain and concern with us. Most importantly, I ask you to accept our request and actively bringing this request directly to the Vietnamese government. And please do this in such a way that effectively draws a positive response from the Vietnamese government. And subsequently, a marked difference made in the right direction, bringing about improvements in human rights, freedom of speech, assembly, freedom of press and expression. I believe Vietnam is a signatory in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and therefore they must be reminded that they must respect their position and standing in the global community. And Australia, being one of the great democracies in the world, as well as having diplomatic ties with Vietnam, can vitally exert request, if not pressure, on the Vietnamese government to again look into these concerned areas. So once again, I sincerely thank you to all of you who are present here for giving your valuable time in listening to us, to our concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Kimpi. May I now invite the Honourable Jason Clare, Chair of the Minister for Trade and Investment, to share a few words with us on this issue. Please put our hands together for
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. We've heard from a number of speakers, a number of very important contributions. I want to add my voice to their thoughts. Thank the Vietnamese community for your presence here in Canberra today. It's just another example of the increasing voice of the Vietnamese Australian community in public debates in Australia on this issue and so many others. I'd like to see a day not too far away where we have a Vietnamese Australian present in the House of Representatives or in the Senate to add to the force of that voice. We did have a Vietnamese Australian in the Parliament only a couple of weeks ago. I managed, when the bells rang for a vote, to grab my little son, who's 6 months old, and scurry him into the Parliament. But when I checked the records afterwards, his vote didn't count. So we need to fix that omission and get Vietnamese Australians not just present in our medical schools and in our courtrooms and in our engineering companies and in our local councils as well, but in the federal parliament as well. I've been very touched and moved by the presentation today because I see through the presentation the stark difference between life here in Australia and life in Vietnam. If an environmental disaster of this magnitude happened in Australia, things would be very different. You can imagine how the outrage of people affected by an environmental disaster like this would have put pressure on the government to react. That the compensation paid by a company would be invested in fixing the lives that have been ruined by the local community. And it would have led to a major independent investigation into what went wrong to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And it certainly wouldn't have led to the sort of events that we've seen in that presentation, where people were denied their opportunity to protest for what is obviously something terrible that has happened which has ruined their lives. So it reminds us all here in Australia, here in the federal parliament, if we ever need reminding, about how lucky we are to live in Australia and how important it is that the rights many Australians take for granted should be the sort of things that other people all around the world should have the privilege to have as well. Chris made the point, Tuan, you made the point about APEC coming up in Vietnam later this year. I think that's an important point to make. I think it will shine a light on the country of Vietnam and provide an opportunity for the people of the world to impress again upon the government of Vietnam how important human rights are. Chris Hayes made the point about trade and how important it is between our two countries. I've reinforced that point. It is important that we continue to build that trade relationship between our two countries. But overlaying that importance of investing time and energy between the Australian government and the Vietnamese government in the human rights dialogue is very important. And what's missing from that is the transparency of what comes out of each and every one of those rounds of negotiations. We should know what's on the agenda and what's agreed to come out of that. None of us should be afraid of information like that. And so I'd like to see that as one step forward. And certainly, from my part, and I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of Claire and Milton and Tim who've received the presentation today, I'll pass that on to Penny Wong, our Shadow Foreign Minister, and provide her with that information so that she might be able to act on it. And I'm sure I speak to government representatives who've been here as well, who I'm sure will pass on this information as well to Julie Bishop. Once again, thank you for being here today. Thank you for being part of our great democracy. And thank you for bringing to our attention some of the enormous environmental tragedy that has happened in Vietnam and the consequences of that we've seen in the presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you, the Honourable Jason Clare. May I now invite Mr. Adam Bent, the federal member for Melbourne in the Australian Greens, to share a few words with us. Please put our hands together for Mr. Adam.
I want to also acknowledge the traditional owners and pay respects to elders past and present. And thank you again for the invitation to be here today and for the briefing. And I want to join my parliamentary colleagues in congratulating the VCA for the work that you do. And I think that there are many things that Australians know about Vietnam, and there are many things that people don't know and that need to know more about. And I think if it wasn't for the work of Vietnam in Victoria, but all of you right across the country, there would be a lot of things that would be swept under the carpet. And part of our role here in Parliament is to, especially those of us who aren't in the governing parties, the role of the Parliament is to hold our government to account. And we also have a very, very privileged position where we can not only give voice to and hold our government to account. But we also have that privileged position of being able to raise and speak out on behalf of people right around the world, and including in our region, who don't have a similar role in their own country. And I think that at the end of the day, everyone has a basic right to clean air, to clean water, to a healthy environment. Everyone has a right to speak their mind. Everyone has a right to practice the religion of their choice. And everyone has a right, if they feel aggrieved, to take matters to their parliament or to their government and redress. And what we are seeing, not very far away from us here in Australia, is all of those things coming together, as you've heard from the presentation, but all of those things coming together in a way that suggests that people are living without any rights at all, without the rights that we take for granted here. When someone's very lively and when their ability to farm, when their ability to go and fish is called into account, well, not through anything that they have done, but from the actions of some companies who are interested in making money and who don't care about the people around them and who don't care about the environment. And when that happens, that is the abuse of one of the most fundamental human rights that there can be. And when people then say, well, you've admitted liability and we want the compensation to flow properly, and when they then further repressed just for asking that someone who's already admitted that they've done the wrong thing take account for it, then that doubles it, it triples that pain. And I want the Vietnamese community to know that we are hearing the message loud and clear, and that we should do what we can to make sure that the rest of the Parliament and the government hears that message. Because trade has been mentioned a few times, and when we had the negotiations for the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, looking like it might go somewhere, you did have, as has been mentioned, you had the Vietnamese government sticking their hand up and saying, well, we want to be part of all of this that's going on, and if as part of that we need to make some changes, then we'll look at that. But what we suspected, and what many of us were concerned about, was that a lot of it was just for show, and was just pretend to get through a certain period of negotiations. Well, we now know that even though Donald Trump has walked away, that there are efforts being put in to cobble it together with different people and with different players. And if that's right, then that's an opportunity for Australia to go to those discussions and say, well, look, seriously, if you want to be part of international agreements, you have to change the way that you treat people in your own country. And we've got a real opportunity, I think, if we speak up loudly, and especially if we speak up across party political lines in the Australian Parliament, to make the Australian government take a different position when it goes off and has those discussions. And one of the other things, I just want to mention a couple of things briefly while I can, that I think that are very important for me. One of the things that I've learned from you, and that I don't think the Australian public recognises, is that there are still, because of the abuses that we've heard, especially from Catholics in the south of Vietnam, there are still people who are coming to Australia trying to seek refugee status and seek asylum. Some of them have come on boats, and Australia has turned those boats back. And it's worthwhile remembering that if we did now in Australia, or if we did 40 years ago in Australia what we're doing now, we would not have the Vietnamese community in Australia here with us. And it's part of my job is to remind people this is actually what is going on. And when we have a situation a year or two ago where I think it was either the biggest group of people or the second biggest group of people in detention in Australia, in refugee detention within the Vietnamese community, I don't think people more broadly in Australia understood that that's what was going on. But that has been what is happening, and I think we have to speak up loudly about it. I guess the last thing that I want to say is that having been to Mekong Delta and travelled around there for a little bit, and knowing just how important it is, not only for the millions of people that live there, but how important it is for sustaining the whole country, and in fact sustaining part of the region. When we think that so much of Vietnam is so close to where sea level is. And when we have scientists telling us now that by the end of this century we may have, because of climate change, between 1 or 2 metre in sea level rise, I think we need to understand what that's going to start to mean as the seas start to rise and the salt water starts coming in and working its way up the rivers, and agriculture starts to decline and people start to get displaced. It's worth remembering that a 1 metre sea level rise will displace between 38 and 50% of people in the delta. And we're potentially going to see millions of people in Vietnam being unable to sustain themselves and sustain their way of life, potentially having to move to seek a better life. And that, I think, is part of the reason why we need to strengthen ties between the Australian people and the Vietnamese people, because unless we get climate change under control, it's going to make life even worse for people who really don't have a lot of rights. It's going to become much, much tougher. So I want to congratulate you once again for making the time to come up here to the People's House. And I want you to know that, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of every MP, no matter what party they are in, who's sitting here, your voices and your pleas are being heard, and we will do our utmost to try and get a change of attitude and a change of practice from the Vietnamese government by getting our government to take some strong action. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Before I introduce our final speaker, the President of the Pahao Buddhist Congregation, I just want to let you know that in our report here on page 7, to talk about, Adam, potentially the sea water rising in some 20 or 30 years' time, people in Vietnam are already saying if they can't fish, they can't live, they are going to find out what their ways to support their livelihood somewhere else. And they've already said that they are going to go to Australia. That is closest to Vietnam. And that's what they already said in this report. We also know about the trade impacts. Don talked about the contaminated fish being stored in hundreds and hundreds of those tons of contaminated fish. What are they going to do? Fish sauce. Who eats a lot of fish sauce? In Australia, a lot of us do. And we also know that the hospitality industry is very, very big here in Australia. And it isn't just going to affect us Vietnamese Australians. It is going to affect every one of us who eats Asian food and Vietnamese food. And we all know we love Vietnamese food. These are some of the minor things that we mentioned. It isn't just 5 or 10 years in the future. It is actually happening right now. And we sincerely hope that we can work with you, the government, the opposition, and members of the parliament from all sides of politics as we continue our efforts. We know our president, Mr. Bon Nguyen, has taken part in the first the first anniversary of the Formosa disaster conference in the US last week. And there are many actions arising out of that, including legal ramifications and remedial actions arising out of that. We know the Australian government is also taking part in the APEC summit towards the end of the year, and we know that we do have the Human Rights Parliamentary Joint Committee. We hope that you are, now that you have heard and seen some of those issues that are affecting the community, not just our own community, but I'm talking about the Australian community more broadly, that you will help us raise the issue and have some concrete actions undertaken. I would now would like to invite Mr. Châu Hoàng Vũ. He is the president of the Buddhist Congregation. In this representatives committee room today, we have some members of the Pahao congregation who are very close friends of Mr. Nguyễn Tân, who died in custody with his neck cut, and Mr. Vương Văn Thả. And we know that what we say and what we do here in Australia will go back to those very people, and we hope that you will continue to support us. Mr. Châu Hoàng Vũ has a speech in English, and he would like me to read it out. I would like to invite Mr. Châu Hoàng Vũ up first, so then I can then read out your speech. I am Châu Hoàng Vũ, President of Pahao Buddhism Congregation of Australia. On behalf of the Vietnamese Society in Vietnam and Australia, I would like to present our major concerns in which the Vietnamese authorities have heavy-handed, suppressed, and in case murdered the Vietnamese people for no reason. In particular, there are 2 cases Tân Châu district has been denied access to any supply of basic needs such as food, electricity, and water. Her family was attacked with bricks, rocks, and dirty waste, which were thrown into his family home. The police, disguised as thugs, harassed and isolated the family because of Mr. Tar's recently released an objector of conscience, has exercised his right to the freedom of expression and criticized the Vietnamese authorities for their systemic expression of corruption, embellishment, and its submissive policy towards the northern neighbor country, China. The second one is on the 2nd of May 2017. In the town of Vĩnh Long, Mr. Nguyễn Hữu Tấn, 39 years old, was detained by the police. On the third day, on the 3rd of May 2017, his family was summoned by the police to come and collect his body, and was told that he had committed suicide whilst in custody. Of course, the family did not believe this. Earlier on, 200 policemen came to Mr. Tenn's house to search for evidence to lay charges. They found the so-called flag of the former Republic of Vietnam, but it was not that flag. They found a piece of yellow cloth, which was wrapped in an edible bird's nest bottle packed by a supplier. They could not find anything else, and that was the reason why they held him in custody. Obviously, the Vietnamese police have killed Mr. Tân and yet clumsily covered it up by leaving a wound around his neck. It sends shockwaves across the Vietnamese community, and in particular the Hoa Hao community, leaving Mr. Tenn's family with extreme pain and anger. We are disappointed and very sorrowful for the death of Mr. Nguyễn Hữu Tấn, and would like to ask that the Australian members of Parliament to help and protect the Vietnamese people, in particular the people of Hoa Hao, from oppression, from torture and murder. That the Australian government sends a special team to investigate the death of Mr. Nguyễn Hữu Tấn. That the international communities, whether it be Amnesty International, the United Nations, the international media, to protest the Vietnamese government from repression against innocent people, especially against the Hoa Hao Buddhist and other religions. Fellow religious associations within Vietnamese community, please all stand up to oppose the Hanoi regime with domestic dissidents, in particular to have the democratic and human rights restored under the United Nations regime. Thank you very much. That concludes our official briefing session this morning. You might wonder, well, where to from here? Obviously, we have been doing this for the last 40 years, so we are not going to stop after today. So please, you will hear from us in terms of the particular actions that we would like your help to help us bring this matter to the Australian Parliament, the Australian government, and that we can have some real concrete action. The Vietnamese community in Australia is cooperating with other Vietnamese communities in the United States, in Canada, and other parts of Europe to ensure that the victims of this disaster and other disasters, and that the freedom that we all enjoy here in Australia, in the United States, in Canada, and in Europe can at some point in time be shared and be seen and take place in Vietnam. On that note, thank you very much. We do have the report. If you haven't seen one, please take one, and no doubt we will follow up with you in the very near future.
Yeah, maybe.